The mystery of the Sodder children. I still remember the chilling December night in 1945 when everything changed for the Sodder family. Nestled in the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, their home was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. The Sodders, George and Jenny, were well liked in the community, and their 10 children were a familiar sight, playing in the fields and running through the quiet streets. I was a close friend of the family, a neighbor who often stopped by for a chat or a cup of coffee. On Christmas Eve, the Sodder house was bustling with excitement. The younger children were eagerly awaiting Santa's arrival, while the older ones helped Jenny with last-minute decorations. I dropped by that evening, sensing the warmth and cheer that enveloped the home. As the night wore on, I left the Sodder home, watching as the lights dimmed and the house grew silent. The peacefulness of the night was shattered a few hours later when I was awoken by the sound of sirens and the glow of flames illuminating the sky. The Sodder house was engulfed in fire. By the time I arrived, the fire had already consumed most of the structure. George and Jenny were outside, frantic and in shock, along with 4 of their children, Sylvia, Marion, John, and George Jr. But 5 others, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were nowhere to be seen. In the chaos that followed, George attempted to save his missing children, but every effort was thwarted. The ladder that usually rested against the house was mysteriously missing, and the trucks he used to haul coal wouldn't start. It was as if an unseen force was preventing any rescue attempts. Helplessly, we watched as the fire reduced the Sodder home to ashes. The fire department arrived too late, and their efforts were futile. By dawn, the once lively house was nothing but smoldering ruins. But the most chilling revelation came when the search for remains began. There were no traces of the 5 missing children. No bones, no evidence that they had perished in the fire. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. As the weeks turned into months, strange things began to happen. George and Jenny received anonymous letters and phone calls, claiming that their children were alive and well. Some even provided detailed descriptions of the missing children, including distinctive features that only those close to them would know. The Sodders were haunted by sightings reported across the country, children resembling theirs seen in different states, always just out of reach. The most unsettling piece arrived a year later, an old photograph of a group of children, one of whom bore an uncanny resemblance to Louis. The message on the back was cryptic: Louis Sodder. I love brother Frankie. Elil boys. A90132 or 35. I joined George in his relentless pursuit of answers, chasing leads that led us into the heart of a conspiracy deeper and darker than we ever imagined. Each step closer unraveled new mysteries, but also threats, as if someone, or something, wanted to keep the truth hidden. Despite our best efforts, every path seemed to lead to a dead end. Each piece of information was a puzzle without an answer, a shadowy clue that left more questions than it resolved. The town buzzed with rumors, theories ranging from mafia involvement to child trafficking, but nothing solid emerged. George and Jenny remained determined, fueled by hope and the love for their missing children. The truth was out there, but so was something sinister, lurking just beneath the surface, ready to strike when we least expected it. I often wondered what the next part of our journey would reveal and if we were truly prepared for the horrors that lay ahead. For in the small, sleepy town of Fayetteville, the past refused to stay buried, and the Sodder children were only the beginning of a nightmare that was just unfolding. A few weeks had passed since the devastating fire, but the air in Fayetteville still felt heavy, thick with unspoken fears and unanswered questions. George and Jenny Sodder, fueled by desperation, began their own investigation, refusing to accept that their children had perished in the blaze. I joined George as he pursued any lead, no matter how far-fetched. The community had its own theories, and whispers filled the air. Some speculated about arson, others about abduction. The story of the Sodder children had taken on a life of its own, drawing the curious and the sinister alike to our small town. One morning, George received a letter postmarked from New York City. It contained a photograph of 5 children standing in front of a dilapidated building. The boy in the center bore a striking resemblance to Maurice, the eldest of the missing children. The letter was unsigned, with only the words "they live" scrawled in an unsteady hand. The photograph reignited George's determination, and he decided to follow this lead to New York. I offered to accompany him, hoping to provide support and a second pair of eyes. As we boarded the train, a sense of foreboding settled over me. It felt as if we were leaving one nightmare, only to step into another. The city was a maze of chaos and noise, a far cry from the quiet familiarity of Fayetteville. We showed the photograph to anyone who would listen, police officers, private investigators, and even strangers on the street. Most dismissed us as delusional or grieving parents clinging to false hope, but one private investigator, a grizzled man named Frank Miller, agreed to help us. Frank was a man of few words, but his reputation preceded him. He had solved cases that had stumped the police for years, often using unorthodox methods. He examined the photograph carefully, nodding slowly as if piecing together a complex puzzle. "I've seen something like this before," Frank muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the city. "Children taken from their homes, used for purposes I'd rather not imagine. It's a dark world out there, Mr. Sodder." The thought chilled me to the bone, but George remained steadfast. "I don't care how dark it is. I want my children back." Frank agreed to meet us the next morning, promising to share any information he uncovered. We returned to our hotel, a small, dingy place that smelled of mildew and stale cigarettes. I lay awake that night, the city's lights casting eerie shadows on the walls, each creak and groan of the building sending shivers down my spine. The next day, Frank brought us to an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. Its windows were boarded up, and the paint peeled like old skin. "This place has been under surveillance for some time," Frank explained. "Rumor is, it's a front for something sinister." As we approached, a sense of dread filled me. The air was cold, biting at my skin. The building loomed like a specter, its silent facade hiding secrets that should never be unearthed. We entered through a side door, the hinges squealing in protest. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the faint stench of decay lingered. We moved cautiously through the corridors, our footsteps echoing ominously. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as if the walls themselves whispered warnings to turn back. In one room, we found makeshift sleeping arrangements, old mattresses strewn about, toys scattered across the floor. It was a chilling sight, one that confirmed our worst fears. Children had been here, perhaps even the Sodder children. But before we could investigate further, a noise from behind startled us. We turned, hearts pounding, only to find the door we had entered was now closed. A figure stood in the shadows, watching us with cold, calculating eyes. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized we were not alone. Frank stepped forward, his hand reaching for the revolver tucked under his coat. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. The figure stepped into the light, revealing a face that was both familiar and strange. It was one of the children from the photograph, older now, with a haunted look in his eyes. "They're coming," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They know you're here." Panic surged through me as a series of loud bangs echoed through the building, footsteps rushing toward us from all directions. We were trapped, caught in a web of darkness and deceit that threatened to swallow us whole. The mystery of the Sodder children had led us into a labyrinth of terror, where each answer only spawned more questions, and every step forward seemed to lead us deeper into the abyss. The abandoned building felt like a living entity, each creak and groan echoing our fears as the footsteps drew nearer. The boy who had emerged from the shadows, a haunting visage of one of the missing Sodder children, stood frozen, his eyes darting between us and the source of the noise. In a sudden, terrifying moment, the door burst open, revealing a group of shadowy figures. They wore masks, their eyes hidden behind dark slits, and they moved with a sinister grace that sent shivers down my spine. One of them raised a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness and landing on our small group. Frank reacted quickly, pulling his revolver and aiming at the intruders. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice echoing through the abandoned halls. The figures paused, but their stance remained aggressive, as if they were waiting for the right moment to strike. The boy tugged at George's sleeve, his voice a strained whisper. "You have to leave. Now. They won't let you escape if you stay." George hesitated, torn between the desire to confront the mysterious figures and the urgency of the boy's warning. In that moment of indecision, I grabbed his arm, nodding toward the boy. "We need to listen. We need to get out of here." Frank nodded in agreement, his eyes never leaving the intruders. "Go." I'll hold them off as long as I can. Find out the truth and get those kids back." Before we could respond, Frank fired a warning shot into the air, the noise reverberating through the building like a gunshot at a funeral. The figures flinched, giving us the momentary distraction we needed to make our escape. We ran through the twisting corridors, the boy leading us with surprising agility. The walls seemed to close in around us, the shadows growing longer and more menacing as we navigated the labyrinth. Every step was a reminder of the danger lurking just behind us, a relentless force determined to keep the Sodder children's fate a mystery. Eventually, we burst through a side exit, the cool night air washing over us like a baptism. The boy urged us on, leading us into the tangled alleys of the city, our footsteps echoing in the empty streets. Behind us, the building loomed like a dark monument, hiding its secrets from the world. Finally, we reached a small, decrepit apartment building. The boy led us inside, up a narrow staircase, and into a cramped room cluttered with papers and photographs. He locked the door behind us, his hands trembling as he turned to face us. "You're safe here, for now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But they'll keep looking. They don't want anyone to know the truth." George sank into a chair, his face etched with a mixture of relief and desperation. "What is going on? Who are those people? And who are you?" The boy hesitated, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "My name is Tommy. I was taken, like the others. But I managed to escape. They're part of a group that takes children for experiments, things I can't even begin to explain. They use us, and when they're done, we disappear." The gravity of his words hit me like a physical blow, the horror of what he described sinking in. "Experiments? What kind of experiments?" Tommy shook his head, his expression haunted. "I don't know all the details. I just know that they need children, and they'll do anything to get them." George leaned forward, his voice urgent. "Do you know anything about my children? Are they still alive?" Tommy nodded slowly, his eyes meeting George's. "I've seen them. They're alive, but I don't know where they're being held now. They move us around a lot, to keep anyone from finding us." The room fell silent, the weight of Tommy's revelations hanging in the air like a dark cloud. The mystery of the Sodder children was more twisted and terrifying than we had imagined, and the stakes were higher than ever. As we plotted our next move, a sudden noise outside the door made us all jump. A soft scratching, followed by a low whisper, sent chills down my spine. Someone was out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Tommy's eyes widened with fear, and he motioned for us to be quiet. We held our breath, the tension in the room palpable as we listened for any further signs of danger. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a reminder of the peril we faced. The door rattled slightly, as if someone was testing the lock. I glanced at George, his face a mask of determination and fear. Whatever was outside, it was clear that we were not safe, even in this temporary refuge. As the noise outside subsided, Tommy turned to us, his voice a hushed whisper. "We need to leave. There's a place we can go, where we might find more answers. But it's not going to be easy." George nodded, his resolve firm. "We'll do whatever it takes. I won't stop until my children are safe." With our path set, we prepared to venture deeper into the darkness, knowing that each step brought us closer to the truth, and the horrors that awaited us in the shadows. The mystery of the Sodder children was far from over, and the chilling secrets it held threatened to consume us all. The city was a blur of lights and shadows as we navigated the labyrinthine streets, each step taking us further from the masked figures who hunted us and closer to the chilling truth behind the Sodder children's disappearance. The list of names and locations burned in George's pocket, our only clue to unraveling the sinister conspiracy we had uncovered. Our journey led us to a nondescript building in Brooklyn, one of the addresses listed beside the names on our cryptic list. It was a run-down apartment complex, the kind of place where secrets festered in the dark corners and no one asked questions. We approached cautiously, our nerves taut with the fear of what we might find. Inside, the building was a warren of narrow hallways and peeling paint. The air was thick with neglect, and a sense of unease settled over us as we climbed the stairs to the third floor. The apartment number matched one from the list, and Tommy knocked softly, his expression tense. After a long pause, the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a wary expression. Her name was Helen, and she had once been part of the same dark world that had ensnared the Sodder children. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. George stepped forward, his desperation evident. "We're looking for our children. We know they were taken, and we believe you can help us find them." Helen's gaze flickered with recognition, and for a moment, I saw a glimmer of empathy. She opened the door wider, motioning for us to enter. Her apartment was sparse, but the walls were covered with newspaper clippings and photographs, faces of children who had disappeared, their eyes staring out like silent witnesses to untold horrors. "I used to work for them," Helen admitted, her voice heavy with regret. "I helped take the children, but I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't live with the guilt." Tommy's eyes widened, and he stepped closer. "You know where they are? You know what they're doing?" Helen nodded, her expression pained. "It's a network, a secret organization that takes children for experiments. They use them to test pharmaceuticals, conduct illegal medical trials. It's all about money and power." The words sent a chill through me, the reality more horrifying than I had imagined. George's face paled, but he clenched his fists, determined to push forward. "Where are they now? Where are my children?" Helen hesitated, her gaze flickering to a map pinned to the wall. "They move them constantly, but the main facility is in New Jersey. It's heavily guarded, but it's where they conduct most of their operations." Hope surged within me, but it was tempered by the enormity of the task ahead. Breaking into a fortified facility was a daunting prospect, but we had come too far to turn back now. George's resolve was unshakable, and I knew we would do whatever it took to rescue the children. Before we could make a plan, a loud crash shattered the tense silence. The door burst open, and the masked figures from the warehouse stormed into the apartment, their presence a terrifying reminder of the danger we faced. Panic surged through me as they advanced, their intentions clear. We had been discovered, and there would be no escape this time. One of the intruders lunged at George, and he fought back with a ferocity born of desperation. In the chaos, Tommy grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the window. "We have to go, now," he urged, his voice barely audible over the din of the struggle. I hesitated, torn between the urge to fight and the need to survive. George's determination fueled my own, and I knew we had to find a way out. Together with Tommy, we clambered onto the fire escape, the frigid air biting at our skin as we made our descent. Below, the alley was a tangle of shadows, the perfect cover for our escape. We ran, hearts pounding, knowing that every moment counted. The city streets stretched before us, a labyrinth of possibility and peril, but we couldn't stop now. The children's lives depended on it. As we fled into the night, Helen's words echoed in my mind. The facility in New Jersey was our last hope, the final piece of the puzzle that might save the missing children. The chilling truth was within our grasp, and we would stop at nothing to uncover it. But as we vanished into the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something far more sinister lurked just beyond the edge of our awareness. The mystery of the Sodder children had drawn us into a world of shadows and secrets, and the final confrontation promised to be more terrifying than anything we had faced before. The drive to the facility in New Jersey felt like a descent into madness. Every mile brought us closer to the truth, and the fear that we might not return from this dark journey loomed large. George sat silently beside me, his face a mask of grim determination. Tommy, our reluctant guide through this nightmare, stared out the window, his expression haunted by memories of his own ordeal. The facility was nestled in a secluded forest, hidden away from prying eyes. It was a sprawling compound surrounded by high fences and guarded by men who patrolled with an air of practiced vigilance. This was no ordinary place, it was a fortress of secrets, and breaching its defenses would require every ounce of courage and cunning we possessed. Under the cover of darkness, we approached the perimeter, slipping past the guards with hearts pounding in our chests. The air was thick with tension, and every sound seemed amplified in the oppressive silence of the night. We navigated through the shadows, inching closer to the heart of the facility where the Sodder children and others like them were held captive. Tommy led us to a service entrance, a forgotten door concealed behind a tangle of vines. With shaking hands, he jimmied the lock, and the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit corridor that stretched into the bowels of the building. We slipped inside, the enormity of our mission pressing down on us like a weight. Inside, The facility was a maze of sterile hallways and locked doors, the atmosphere charged with an unsettling stillness. We moved swiftly, guided by Tommy's memories of his time here, our footsteps echoing in the vacant halls. My pulse quickened with each step, the anticipation of what lay ahead both exhilarating and terrifying. Finally, we reached a large room filled with rows of metal cages. Inside were children, their eyes wide with fear and confusion, their innocence stolen by the horrors they had endured. Among them, I spotted familiar faces: Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, the missing Sodder children, alive and terrified. George rushed forward, his voice choked with emotion. "My God, my children," he cried, reaching through the bars to touch them, tears streaming down his face. The children responded with cries of joy and relief, their small hands grasping his desperately. It was a reunion tempered by the harsh reality of their captivity, but it was a moment of hope amidst the darkness. As we worked to free the children, a sudden noise behind us sent my heart racing. The masked figures had found us, their presence a chilling reminder that we were not alone. They moved silently into the room, surrounding us with cold precision, their intentions unmistakable. One of them stepped forward, removing his mask to reveal a face that sent a jolt of recognition through me. It was Frank Miller, the private investigator who had promised to help us. The betrayal cut deep, a blade of deceit hidden beneath a veneer of trust. "Frank, how could you?" I asked, my voice trembling with disbelief. Frank's expression was unreadable, a mixture of regret and resignation. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. "But this is bigger than you know. These children, they're part of something much larger." George faced him, anger and betrayal etched in every line of his face. "They're just children. You're using them for experiments, for profit." Frank nodded, his eyes hard. "It's not just about profit. It's about power, control. The world is changing, and these children are the key to the future." Before we could react, the room filled with an eerie hum, the lights flickering as a strange energy crackled in the air. The children began to convulse, their bodies writhing as the energy surged through them. I watched in horror as their eyes rolled back, their mouths open in silent screams. "Stop this!" George shouted, desperation in his voice. Frank shook his head, stepping back as the masked figures moved to restrain us. "It's too late," he said. "The process has already begun." The room seemed to shift around us, the air charged with an unnatural force. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread, as if the fabric of reality was unraveling before my eyes. The children were changing, their forms blurring and distorting in ways that defied explanation. And then, in a moment of blinding clarity, I saw the truth. The children were not just test subjects, they were conduits for something otherworldly, a dark force that sought to break through into our world. The experiments were not about creating a better future, they were about opening a door to a nightmare. The realization hit me like a wave, and I understood that we were standing on the precipice of something far more terrifying than I had ever imagined. The Sodder children were not just victims, they were the harbingers of a horror that threatened to consume us all. As the energy reached its peak, the building began to tremble, the walls cracking under the strain. In the chaos, I grabbed George and Tommy, pulling them toward the exit. We had to escape, to warn the world of what was coming. We fled through the corridors, the ground shaking beneath our feet, the sound of the children's cries echoing in our ears. Behind us, the facility began to collapse, the darkness swallowing it whole. Outside, the night sky was ablaze with an unnatural light, a beacon of the impending doom that loomed over us. We stumbled into the forest, the weight of our failure heavy on our shoulders. As we watched the facility crumble, I knew that the truth of what had happened here would never be fully known. The world would remain ignorant of the horrors that lurked in the shadows, and the Sodder children's fate would remain a chilling mystery, a story whispered in hushed tones, a warning of the darkness that lies just beyond the edge of our understanding. The Sodder children were lost to us, but their story would live on, a reminder of the thin line between reality and nightmare. The truth we had uncovered was more horrifying than we could ever have imagined, a dark secret that threatened to unravel the very fabric of our world. The end.